Good evening, I'm Jim Lehrer. On the NewsHour tonight, the latest in the saga of Teamster's President Ron Kerry. Coverage of the killing of 57 tourists in Egypt. A look at Arab opinion about the Iraq crisis. Some perspective on the release of a leading Chinese dissident. And a Richard Rodriguez essay about police photographs. It all follows our summary of the news this Monday. There was a mass murder in Egypt today. 57 visitors to an ancient temple were shot and killed. It happened outside the southern Egyptian town of Luxor on the Nile River. Gunmen started shooting in a courtyard where tourists had just gotten off a bus. Police guarding the temple returned fire, and a gun battle lasted 3 hours. Interior Ministry officials said 2 police officers and 6 of the gunmen also died. The violence was blamed on Islamic militants, but there was no immediate claim of responsibility. We'll have more on this story later in the program. On the Iraq story today, the United States rejected an Iraqi proposal to end the crisis. Yesterday, Deputy Prime Minister Tariq Aziz said UN weapons inspection teams would be allowed in Iraq if they included fewer Americans. White House spokesman Mike McCurry said it was not for Iraq to dictate the composition of the groups. This afternoon in Kansas, President Clinton spoke about the situation.
I am trying to settle this issue peacefully, but our diplomatic efforts must be backed by our strong military capability. We cannot rule out any options, but the bottom line is we have to understand this. It is essential that those inspectors go back to work. The safety of the children of the world depends upon it.
6 American arms inspectors were expelled Thursday, and the UN withdrew most of its remaining monitors in protest. They were charged with ensuring Iraq destroyed its weapons of mass destruction as required by the '91 Gulf War ceasefire. We'll have more on the Iraq story later in the program. Now that killing of more than 50 tourists today in Egypt, we begin with a report from Mark Dyson of Independent Television News.
The sheer numbers of casualties became evident as the first pictures of the aftermath of the attack came out of Luxor tonight. What's clear is that it was by far the worst example of violence against tourists in Egypt in recent years. A busload of Japanese tourists had been flagged down by 6 men dressed in police uniforms who attacked the occupants with rifles and swords. Gunmen hijacked a second bus, killing French, Swiss, German, and at least 2 British passengers.
We saw one of the terrorists made it to a bus that was parked in front of ours, and he took it and drove off around towards the Valley of the Queens. And we saw about 10 or 15 policemen proceed up to the dunes overlooking part of the area and just start firing on the bus with all sorts of stuff. Machine guns and small arms and such.
Only 2 months ago, a bomb on a bus killed 9 German tourists outside the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. Since 1992, Egypt's lucrative tourist industry has been repeatedly targeted. The attacks blamed on various extremist Islamic factions opposed to the secular government of President Hosni Mubarak. One faction is Al-Jihad, another is Jama Al Islameh, whose spiritual leader, Sheik Omar Abdul-Rahman, is in jail in the United States in connection with the bombing of the World Trade Center. The first foreign tourist to die in the militant-related violence was British nurse Sharon Hill, killed 5 years ago last month after an ambush on a bus. Over the course of the following 2 years, a sustained campaign by the militants led to the murders of another 11 foreign tourists, with scores more injured. By then, tourism was being hit hard. The number of foreign visitors to Egypt fell by over 1 million. For a while, attacks became more sporadic, until April last year, when 17 Greek tourists were massacred outside a hotel in Cairo near the pyramids. Apparently, they'd been mistaken for Israelis. 16 months ago, a unilateral ceasefire was called by some imprisoned Islamic leaders, which was endorsed by Sheikh Rahman from his cell in America. The apparent easing of the tension brought back the tourists. But this September, after the firebomb attack outside the Egyptian Museum, which killed 9 German tourists, it seemed clear the ceasefire had all but broken down, and security in Cairo reached new heights.
Here now is Mohammed WAHBY, a political columnist for the Egyptian magazine Al-Mussawar and a former information minister in the Egyptian Foreign Service. Welcome. What are the political motives of these various Islamic fundamentalist terrorist groups?
I mean, their first motive, of course, is to undermine the rule of the regime of President Mubarak. They wanted to establish an Islamic state, similar to the one that we have in Iran, or similar to the one that we are having in the south of Egypt, in Sudan. But they have not succeeded, actually, in rallying the people around them, because people in Egypt know that the example of Iran or the example of Sudan is not an example to follow. So they are in a dilemma, and that's why they resort to this violence in an attempt to undermine the regime of Hosni Mubarak.
And who are they? What kind of folks are they within Egyptian society?
They are actually, if you talk in terms of in economic terms, they are usually belonging to the lower middle class, the poor, the unemployed, and those who fall back on religion as the only way of solution. They say Islam is the solution. They think of Islam as the solution of their poverty. They think of Islam as the solution to all the ills of Egypt. And at the same time, we must admit as well that the approach that the government has adopted in fighting these people may not be, or has not proved so far to be the most ideal or the most effective approach.
Describe that approach.
So far, the government has actually emphasized very much the security approach. They depend very much on the police. They depend very much on violence against violence. And they have succeeded to a great extent in cutting down these groups to size. But at the same time, even though we have had a lull in terrorist incidents in Egypt for quite some time, but now they are proving that they are still there, and therefore you must open up the political system in Egypt in order to divide in order to divide the ranks of the Islamic fundamentalists. There are those who are moderates and those who are extremists, and we must make the distinction between the extremists and the moderates. Unfortunately, in Egypt, we have not made that distinction.
The moderates have no outlet now, is that what you're saying? No political outlet?
Yes, because unfortunately, all religious parties in Egypt, including the Muslim Brothers, which is one of the oldest parties in Egypt, has been outlawed.
Is there any connection between these terrorists and those who assassinated President Sadat 16 years ago?
Oh, yes, of course.
Same deal.
The same group, the same group. And actually already there has been the Jama Al Islameh, which is the Islamic group, has already claimed responsibility for the attack. And they have even called actually for the release of Sheik Omar Abdul-Rahman, their leader, from American prisons.
Why do they target tourists?
They target tourists because this is the way which they think they can hit the government very, very hard. Tourism in Egypt is one of the biggest sources of revenues, and by depriving Egypt of this, they shake the very economic foundation of Egypt.
And the end result is it scares, something like happened today, a terrible tragedy, scares other people from going. In fact, the U.S. government issued a warning late this afternoon not to even go to certain parts of Egypt. That's what they want, right?
That is true. But at the same time, even though they think they are only fighting the government, they are more and more alienating the people of Egypt. Instead of rallying them around them, they have alienated the people of Egypt as such, because people in Egypt do not like violence. They are very much against violence.
All right. Mr. WAHBY, thank you, and don't go away. Now, moving on to another story from the Arab world, the reactions there to the crisis with Iraq. Charles Krause begins with a report on Secretary of State Albright's efforts there this weekend.
Secretary of State Madeleine Albright spent Sunday hopscotching her way through 4 Persian Gulf states. Her purpose to try to convince Arab allies that Iraqi President Saddam Hussein must not be allowed to block UN weapons inspectors from returning to Iraq to do their work. Albright's one-day diplomatic mission included visits to Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia. The last 3 stops were late additions to the trip, which originally was to focus on a U.S.-sponsored economic conference in Qatar. That conference was designed to bring together Israeli and Arab business and political leaders, but many Arab governments boycotted the meeting, a sign of the deteriorating condition of the Middle East peace process. In Qatar, Albright held a press conference where she laid out the U.S. position of no negotiations with Saddam on the weapons inspection issue. She also said the U.S. has reason to believe that Saddam may be taking advantage of the crisis to restart illegal weapons production.
In recent days, tensions have increased as a result of Iraq's effort to exercise a veto over who may serve on UN inspection teams. In addition, Iraq has tampered with UN cameras and illegally moved equipment which could be used in the production of prohibited missiles or biological warfare agents.
Afterwards, in Bahrain, Albright met with the UN weapons inspectors who were pulled out of Iraq last week, including the 6 American inspectors who were ordered out by Saddam Hussein.
We cannot know for certain why Iraq chose this particular moment to choose this particular fight with UNSCOM inspectors.
Government officials in Bahrain reportedly told Albright they agreed that Iraq should comply with the UN resolution on arms inspectors. But they also reportedly said they were concerned about civilian casualties in the event military force is used to punish Saddam Hussein. Albright heard those same concerns in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, which both share borders with Iraq. Kuwaiti and Saudi leaders reportedly told Albright that while they too support the U.S. position against Saddam, they would oppose the use of military force. On a more positive note yesterday, Albright was able to announce that both Russia and France had agreed to use their, quote, unique ability to communicate with Saddam Hussein to try and convince him to defuse the crisis by allowing U.S. weapons inspectors back into Iraq. And today, State Department officials arriving with Albright in Pakistan said the United States would support more humanitarian assistance for Iraq if the inspectors were allowed to return. But Iraq's representative to the United Nations called that suggestion a non-starter.
Mohammed WAHBY, an Egyptian journalist and former government official, is still here. He's joined by FOUAD AJAMI, Director of Middle East Studies at the NITSA School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University, and RAGHIDA DERGHAM, Senior Diplomatic Correspondent for Al-Hayat, an Arab newspaper published from London. I got that right finally. FOUAD AJAMI, how would you describe Arab opinion about the Iraqi crisis?
Well, I don't think that really, Jim, there is any one Arab opinion about this crisis, as there is no one single American opinion about this crisis. The Arab world is divided, but I think we have to look at, and if you take a look at different states, they line up differently. The Egyptians who rode with us in the Gulf War of 1990-91 have second thoughts about the American position, and they have great sympathy for Iraq. The Palestinians must share this sympathy for Iraq as well. The Jordanians, in good measure. And I think that the Arab world looks at this crisis and is not convinced that Saddam is the menace that we've made him out to be. And in many ways, let's give the devil his due. Saddam has succeeded. He's forced the world's attention to be focused on these sanctions, which have been in existence for 7 years and have outlived their use in many ways.
Yeah. RAGHIDA DERGHAM, how do you read the Arab reading of his threat, the threat of Saddam Hussein, the chemical and biological weapons, the whole inspectors issue?
They put it in the context of the balance of power in the region. They put it in the context of who else in the region has these weapons of mass destruction. They point out to the fact that Israel is not questioned about acquisition of such weapons, whereas the Arabs are. But I think the larger issue is now, the question for many in the Arab world is that what is the objective? If the objective is to get rid of Saddam Hussein, the downfall of Saddam Hussein, then the attitude is fish or cut bait. If it is the weapons of mass destruction, then it's much more interesting to keep inspectors, international inspectors, inside Iraq so that there will be an ongoing watch of these weapons. And if it is the implementation of the Security Council resolutions, then one should stick to the letter of these resolutions so that if compliance is guaranteed by Iraq, then eventually that oil embargo should be lifted in accordance to the report of UNSCOM. And finally, sanctions should be hopefully in the interim, the 986 resolution, oil for food and medicine, hopefully it should be expanded to include education, for example, rather than allow the fabric of the society to disintegrate.
So, in other words, if the emphasis is just on the weapons of mass destruction, what's the big deal about the composition of the teams, whether they're Americans or not, the U.S. should make such a big deal about it?
No, I think the issue is not to allow, again, even in the Arab world, it is not acceptable that Saddam Hussein dictates to the Security Council and to ONSCOM. So this is not what people are asking for. But I think that sentiment is towards take account of what's going on, take stock of what's going on. If there is compliance, it's all right to reward it. And if this is not the idea, then we should expect Saddam Hussein to be defiant as he is. And the issue is the issue of defiance comes in the Arab mind as well, because when you look at the defiance of Saddam Hussein, it's normally met with armed conflict, and when the defiance of Mr. Benjamin Netanyahu of Israel, he's absolved. So people look at it in this context. They take a look at the whole region rather than only Saddam Hussein, and this is not in support of Saddam Hussein. The sentiment is for Iraq, the country, the Iraqi people suffering under sanctions. I wouldn't agree with those who say that Saddam Hussein is going to be the savior of the Arabs. I think his legacy and his history disqualified him from playing this role.
Yeah, Mr. WAHBY, would you agree that that the average Egyptian makes a distinction between Iraq and Saddam Hussein?
Oh, there's no question about that. Not only the average Egyptian, but the average Arab. And here I would disagree with Professor AJAMI totally. He himself contradicted himself when he said there is the Arabs do not think of Saddam Hussein as such and such and such. And then he said there are so many opinions in the Arab world. You cannot really say that the Egyptians and the Jordanians see eye to eye on this. Actually, as a matter of fact, the Egyptians, the Jordanians, the Moroccans, the Saudi Arabians, I just made a tour of the Arab world. And I can assure you that in as far as Saddam Hussein is concerned, yes, people are against him. Yes, people are against what he did. There's no question about that. But at the same time, people are very much against the use of military force, because they realize very much that such military force would destabilize the region. Even after using the military force, you may end up with Saddam Hussein again playing up cat and mouse with the United States, and at the same time people see what is happening now, a flagrant case of double standards in as far as the United States is concerned, because they ignore what Saddam Hussein has been doing and what and at the same time focus totally on they ignore what Mr. Netanyahu has been doing and concentrate only on what Mr. Saddam Hussein has been doing.
And they see those as parallel situations.
Actually, as a matter of fact, what Saddam Hussein has done recently is not to be compared with what Mr. Netanyahu has done. Saddam Hussein has not said that the United Nations should not go ahead with the inspection. He has objected only to, he has confined his complaint to the United States. He is saying that he doesn't want the United States, being the adversary, and as far as concerned, to be at the same time the judge. By dominating the inspection team, the United States is both the adversary and the judge. He doesn't want that. But he's wrong, no question about that. The Arab world is against it. But at the same time, that offense cannot be compared to the offense which Mr. Netanyahu has been doing, and which also the United States has been protecting him from the anger of the world community, to the extent that the United States has been left in many instances in a minority of three: the United States, Israel, and Micronesia.
Jim,
well, yes.
may I just get into this? I mean, this analysis by Mr. WAHBY tells you exactly what the dilemma in the Arab world is. I don't think we were talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. This linkage, if you will, this is the old argument that we thought we buried in the Gulf War of 1990-91, that there was a linkage between what Saddam was doing and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Saddam is a brigand. He's a threat to his own people. Israel has nothing to do with this. But this tells you exactly what this crisis is all about for President Clinton. This is Groundhog Day, that famous movie by Bill Murray, where the same thing happens all over again. So we're back again because we never removed Saddam. We're back with some of the same Arab illusions about Saddam, that he's going to make the linkage between Israel and the Palestinian question on the one hand and the Gulf on the other. The weapons of mass destruction and the threat that Saddam represents both to his neighbor and the torment to his people, these are the issues that truly matter. What Netanyahu is doing, what Israel is doing, this has nothing to do with it. It just tells you that we waged this great imperial campaign in 1990-91, and we left the man, Saddam, in his bunker, and we gave an opportunity for these old ghosts and these old arguments, such as the ones expressed by Mr. WAHBY, to resurface, and we are there again.
We are there again, and now what do we do about it?
Well, I think my own feeling has, I had this little cliche in a piece I did in the Daily News, the New York Daily News, that what we should do is we should be very clear about what Saddam represents. We should either get him or forget him. And we have done neither. We have not unseated Saddam Hussein. We have left these sanctions. And now our president says, in effect, that these sanctions, in an unguarded moment, President Clinton says that these sanctions will stay till the end of time. These sanctions cannot stay till the end of time. So we don't put our soldiers in harm's way. We don't support the democratic struggle or even the democratic possibility of the Iraqi opposition to Saddam. We cut them off the payroll, and then we say that Saddam is a great menace. And we have our Secretary of Defense showing up on one of the talk shows with a 5-pound bag of sugar to tell us that, look, if this was anthrax, this would destroy us all. And we are completely confused, and the Clinton administration has not clarified exactly what the threat of Saddam is all about.
Yeah.
Yes, Raghida.
Yes, I was going to say that this is really very much a problem, that there is a lot of confusion as to what is intended from now on. I believe that if there is going to be a military operation, and if it's going to be yet another Tomahawk missiles attack into Iraq, I don't even think the Gulf states will welcome that. I think they would want it to be those countries who do not object to the military option. They would want it to be decisive, to hit the very infrastructure of the regime. Otherwise, they don't want it. So in effect, the decision right now is to either go all the way against Saddam Hussein to bring his downfall, or really sit back and say, well, we have to see what we can do. 986, that resolution should be expanded so that it will include other infrastructure and society, in the society of Iraq, and also to just take stock of where we go from here, including possibly a dialogue, so that with the dialogue, pockets more through Saddam, including the constitution that he claims he has, through a dialogue, force him to deliver, so that the opposition should start to function from within, because the opposition on the outside has so far failed to prove the point.
So what did you think of FOUAD AJAMI's idea, either get him or forget him? Is that kind of what you're saying too?
Yes, I'm agreeing with that idea.
Yeah.
It's exactly what I said. I said fish or cut bait. Enough of this going on pretending that we are both places and having the Iraqi people pay the price. I think either go all the way or start to really go by the letter of the resolutions, lift the sanctions when he delivers to ONSCOM, and in the meantime strengthen that oil for food resolution and expand it to include education and clean water and that sort of thing.
Mr. WAHBY, get him or forget him?
Yes, I would agree, and I think most of the Arabs also would agree with that. There's only one point that I would like to make, and that's that the linkage is still there, and Mrs. Albright has admitted that. She said that by the fact that the peace process in the Middle East is collapsing, more or less, is making it much more difficult to get the support of the Arab countries on so many other issues, including Iraq.
And that's whether anybody likes it or not, the linkage is there?
The linkage is there in the minds of the Arabs, and therefore we cannot ignore it. We'll have to deal with it at the same time.
Well, it is because of policy, really, because of the American policy towards the region. That's where the linkage comes in.
Yes.
And because the peace process, in fact, started after the Gulf War.
Exactly.
And people were hoping that it will lead somewhere. And the fact that it's collapsing at the hands of, from the point of view of the Arabs, Mr. Netanyahu, then that's where the linkage is very strong.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we have to leave it there. Thank you all three very much.
Thank you.